All right, we're live, everyone. Hey, thanks for everyone who was able to join us today. In the area, we've been having some storms, some weather knocking out power here and there. I had to move my location last minute. Others might have as well. So I'm glad that to see everyone on this call that was able to make it. Hopefully, more can make it as we go forward. My name is Scott Hamler. I was class of 2019, best class ever of leadership Charlottesville. I'm also on the LCAA board. And I would like to introduce you to our panelists, CPD Chief Brackney. If you could just give a little wave each time I say your name. And from ACPD, alums of LC 19 and 20 respectively, Captain Daryl Byers. Where'd he go? Is it which? And Captain Sean Reeves. Are they still on the call?
Yeah. Let's
okay,
see.
Cool. I don't know if I can see everyone.
I don't.
But they said at the top that they were having troubles at their precinct with internet as well. So hopefully we can get them back in here. Yeah. Hopefully we can get them back in here. Like I said, we're just dealing with the elements, and we can't call for these things. But they're panelists as well. And Don Gathers with Black Lives Matter Charlottesville. Give a wave, Don. And a whole host of other organizations, very active member of the community. I would just like to thank them all for being panelists here. And we just kind of wanted to, this is our second Courageous Conversations meeting. We just wanted to have these because we're not able to meet as alum. Oh, there they go. Sean Reeves, can you hear me?
Yes, we're back. We had power outage.
Back. Yeah,
hey,
we figured.
Someone just mentioned that they couldn't hear.
She's working now.
Can
She's
anyone
up now.
else?
She
Okay.
says now it's working.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Adrian, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can. It took
Okay.
just a second.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Captain Sean Reeves and Captain Daryl Byers are also on the panel today from ACPD. They are able to join us. I'm so glad you guys were able to get that generator cranking or whatever it is you did to get the internet working. But as I was saying, this is our second Courageous Conversations, and we would prefer to have these things in person, but of course we want to be safe and distance ourselves, but we don't want to, there's a lot of important things going on besides COVID. There's a lot of topics and things that we want to talk about and converse as a community, and especially as leaders of the community. We want to hear one another's voices. So I appreciate everyone being here. So the first thing I just want to throw out there is the first topic is defund the police, right? Everybody's hearing it. It's at the top of, a lot of the conversations. So I'm going to throw to the panel, what is defund the police? And Captain Reeves and Captain Byers, I want to throw it to you first. Can you explain what that actually means? Because I think a lot of people are having trouble with the definition.
Scott?
Yeah.
Ladies first.
Oh, excuse me. Well, they had unmuted themselves. You're right. You're absolutely right, Captain Brackney.
Goodness gracious. So first I want to throw out there that I am a Pittsburgh graduate of class of 19, not based on the year. They do it based on the classes. So I've been there about 15 years ago. So shout out to the leadership program and the work that it does across the nation. Most people tend to think that it's only in their community. This is a national initiative to introduce leaders and up and coming leaders into these different social topics in different environments. So the first thing I would talk about is where you're talking about defund the police, is that so far I don't think we've come up with a collective, a shared or agreed upon understanding of what does that language mean. And it has different meanings for different people, and we have not really dug deep into what that understanding is. So when we're giving these opinions, they're often our own personal perspective on what that means, and not necessarily one that is collective or reflective of our agencies or the communities that we serve. So I like to reframe it so that we don't get caught in the actual definitions as much as I think about what does that mean to individuals? What is the message? What are they trying to get across as the action items that they would like to see? And I often use not defund, but I use words like decouple, separate, redistribute responsibilities so that they're adequately placed in the wheelhouse for those experts who are able to address those issues. So I use, instead of defund, how do we refund, R-E-F-U-N-D, refund those different entities who may be better suited to address some of our societal ills, where we as a society have been, particularly our legislatures, have been complicit in pulling funding away from social programs that were meant to support communities. And instead, we've been extremely expedient and efficient at dropping everything into a single, what I call a 911 bucket. That if you dial 911, that policing entity will be the force, literally and figuratively, that addresses whatever those societal ills are. So I think in Charlottesville, particularly, and in the region of Albemarle, UVA, and collectively some of those other ones, we might need to have a conversation with the community as to what that means to them, and then how do we move forward with getting us to that space, whether it's how we are in schools, how we engage in the mental health system, how we engaged in those individuals who are unsheltered or homeless, what happens in low wealth communities, and what happens in minority communities as we introduce policing into those communities. So I think there's really a much needed conversation about identifying a definition, and then how do we build on what does that expectation of management look like? And are there processes that we can put into place to ensure that the need is being met if we're redistributing that responsibility to another bucket system?
Brackney. And yeah, I want to also throw it to the ACPD as well. What are your guys' thoughts about the term and what it means, what it should mean, and what it means to you?
Chief Brackney, hit on several key areas, and what it means to defund the police. Are we talking about defunding the police, or are you talking about abolishing the police? And that's a message that oftentimes gets conflated, and there's confusion with even amongst protesters of what that is. So the chief's point, I think when people say defund the police, we have to ask, what do you mean by that? Because the reaction is when somebody stands in front of the police department with an abolish the police department, or we're going to de-police, or we're going to have a police-free society, that's very different than reallocating resources and financial resources to others. Because if you talk to at least the conversations we're having in Albemarle County and tangentially other law enforcement, there are certain things that we want to get out of business of. The mental health industry, you're not going to see much pushback from officers who aren't medical professionals that are making these split-second decisions. Another social services program, Chief Brackney, she calls it a bucket. We call it a junk drawer. The police department's become that junk drawer of all society's woes. It's like, hey, deal with it. And then when something goes wrong, and then everybody looks at the police department, and you have people that quite frankly aren't trained, and that's not their field of expertise. So it's good that we're having these conversations. But to your point about defunding the police, it has to have some sort of clear definition. We're talking about defunding, refunding, reallocating resources, or abolishing. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Daryl.
Thank you. And Don, I want to throw the same question to you. What does defund the police, when people say that, what does that mean when you hear that, and what do you think about that?
Well, as the officers have said, the captains and the chief have said, it means many different things to many different people. but it all falls under the umbrella of the necessity to reform what we currently see in policing. And many people say defund and reallocate, many say abolish, but it all falls under the umbrella of reform. And when you hear the chants and the calls to defund, what it doesn't mean personal attacks on any officer or any chief or any head of any of the local or really nationwide agencies. From my perspective, it's just the institutions that they head up and that they represent. The calls to defund are not meant to be personal in any way, at least not from my perspective. I think that it's just the call to action and the call to say what we presently have, the model that we have embraced for so long, it's not working. So we need to look at doing something different and in different ways.
Yeah, well said, Don. Thank you, everyone.
I have a question.
Yeah, Andrea?
Don, you said it's not working. Is it really not working? Is it because you hear folks say it's working as it was intended, how it was designed? And I mean, I'd like to hear how the officers feel about that as well.
Well, it certainly is not working, and over the course of history in this country, it's obvious that it hasn't worked for people of color. Now, rather it's working as it was designed to work. You know, from all appearances, especially if you just look on the surface or if you take deep dives into it, yeah, it appears to be working just as it was intended, especially when you look at the laws across the country that have been passed throughout the origin of time. It is doing exactly what it was intended to do, and for people of color, it was just never set up and designed to be for us.
So, Andrea, you're exactly right. The system is brutally efficient. It is working exactly the way that it was designed in the 1700s. That's when the first one, and there were two different types of policing systems that were introduced into the United States of America. There was a Southern style of policing, and there was a Northern style of policing, and both of them were built on systems of economies, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. So it is extremely effective, and it is extremely efficient in the way that it was built. So in the 1700s, the first slave patrol started in South Carolina. People believed that they were only put out there, that these slave patrols were only put out to stop slaves from escaping. And that's not true. It was to enforce the norms, the mores, and the values of the slaveholders so that there wouldn't be insurrections, that there wouldn't be uprisings, and that there would not be resistance to the current system that had been put into place. So this was built on a system of terror and punishment and retribution from the very beginning. So that's how modern policing actually got its start in the South. In the North, it was a very different one. It was a social contract that had been created, again, based on economies. The very first one in Boston, then it moved to like Philadelphia, New York, the Chicago, where you see these long-standing police departments. They were also built on economies, right? That there was a gentry or gentrified community, an economic class community who wanted protections really of their properties against those persons who were poor and were immigrants. So how do you create and construct a way in which you can legally enforce the visions and the economies, both of the South and of the North, that were built on systems, as Don said, not to benefit people of color, not just people of color. It was the poor, it was indigenous, it was the uneducated, the ill-informed. And the easiest way to do that, particularly in the South, was by complexion, skin tone, and your status as a slave. So it is a brutally effective and efficient system designed as operated, and it has never been for the benefit of anyone other than the upper class and those with wealth and those with status and those with power and authority.
John?
Before the captain step in, but even coupling with that, when you fast forward to the 20th century and legislation that was enacted then, when you speak about the crime bill, when you speak about 3 strikes, you're out, when you talk about the sentencing variations between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, what Chief said was absolutely correct. Going back to the 1700s when they were first written and enacted, not a whole lot has changed. Coming forward 300 years, those same types of mindsets and legislative actions are still taking place even today.
And you're exactly right. I was going to say, go ahead, Captains, when you jump in there. You're exactly right, Don.
Yeah, and to echo that, you fast forward today in modern day policing, and you have line level officers who are on the street that are enforcing laws that are on the books. And that's kind of where, we don't sentence folks, we'll conduct investigations, we'll make arrests, but that's an introduction. We introduce people into the criminal justice system, which is a larger system. So we don't get involved with the sentencing and sentencing guidelines when it comes to that. And so our officers are placed in this dynamic of we're enforcing the will of these politicians, these laws that have been on the books for a while. And if it's not a law, and if it doesn't exist, then we're not going to enforce it.
But I would just push back a tiny bit there. And this is where I think we've been complicit and extremely complicit in law enforcement, that sliver, that very narrow, as Captain Reeves said, portion of the entire criminal justice system. Under the 14th Amendment, and there's a panel discussion I'm doing, it says, the 14th Amendment says specifically that we should not make or enforce any law which abridges the privileges or the immunities, right, of our citizens. That gave the states for the first time the power that took it away from federal government to do this, right? That's when we get into these state rights, things of that nature. So when we have been enforcing laws that we knew were abridging those privileges, that's where the profession has not held itself accountable to the standards that we should have. And there was a comment about 4 years ago from the IACP president, Terrence Cunningham, that said he apologized for the past wrongs of policing across the nation and how we have not lived up to the fullness of our oath. The only thing is he didn't go far enough. He said it was our past. I pushed back and said, what about the present? It's those present actions that are also continuing that legacy of harm. So we have a lot of work to do in our own profession in order to really understand the full nature of how this institution was built and how complex the institution was built, the complexities that it was built upon, and never really for those persons who we now are demanding, and rightfully so, that the Constitution and the law serve, as Don just rightfully said, about the disproportionate and disparate ways in which we introduce people into the criminal justice system or we move them through it.
Thank you all. I appreciate all those perspectives. And going back to, you all spoke to the history of, law enforcement and laws and how it has disproportionately and negatively affected communities of color and communities of lower income. What steps, just speaking to your departments, what steps are you taking to heal that, to rectify that, to engage with the community on a more positive level? I think everyone would like to hear what you're doing on the local level to help mend these relationships that have been torn apart for centuries.
So thanks, Scott. So one of the things that we're doing is we're definitely engaging in what we consider to be some of the marginalized communities in the greater Albemarle County region. And so we've been in constant conversation with these groups to try to see how it is that we can better serve them. what it is that we can do better, how can we be better, and how can we partner. I think the last time we had this conversation, we talked about these relationships and how you have to build these relationships before large-scale incidents occur. And that's one of the things that we've been working on. That's one of the things that we continue to work on, is to make sure that we have established relationships with these communities. The other thing that we're doing, and I think we will continue to do, is we'll invite the community in to, if you will, inspect our police department. And by that, I mean, we will have citizens police academies, so they can come in and kind of learn what it is that we do, see what it is that we do, kind of pull the curtain back so they can see everything that goes on inside the police department. I think that's important for the citizens to know what's going on in their police department.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jean McCusker. A friend referenced a book recently, and I haven't had a chance to look at it or read it, so I don't know which way it leans. But the book was, what was it called? The Militarization of the Police, and it talked about how the role of the police has had to change, and they're no longer the cop on beat walking down the street getting to know the community. They've really had to step up, and that's what's causing a lot of the violence as well. Could you all speak to that? Not, like I said, I don't know anything about the book, but I found the concept very interesting.
Yeah, and I'll circle back to that, and then I'd like to hear Chief Brackney's opinion on that. Going back to our work with the marginalized communities as well, it's not just our African-American community. We do a lot of work with our local Latino community, whether it's the Charlottesville Community ID card program. Chief Brackney and I have gone to that. You know, I go before COVID, the first Saturday every month, go and talk about police relations and how we're not immigration, we're not ICE, and we don't conduct raids and immigration roundups. We also work with the Church of the Incarnation and pass out bicycle helmets, do bicycle safety days, do community events with Southwood. So there's a variety of things that our police departments do that may not always make it on social media. There's a lot of things that we do in private meetings that the public just wants to have private to build that trust. So to build that trust with them, we don't want to make our community feel like they're props and part of some political agenda. We want to be sincere when we have meetings and listen to their concerns and actually take action on them. As far as the policing, I can't speak to other jurisdictions across the country. That's another topic that means something different to different people. But as a military veteran myself and somebody who's served overseas and come back to this country, that there are occasions where we need equipment to protect our officers and protect the public. And so that might seem intimidating or scary to some folks, but it's to protect our officers. We have shifted under President Obama's report on policing in the 21st century from a warrior mindset. That was a big mantra even when I came in the early 2000s, and when I was in the military in the late 90s, early 2000s as well. Is we're warriors and we're training people to be warriors, and we had to shift that to guardians and protectors. And that's part of that mindset, and that's part of that mental shift. Is we're here to protect and serve our community, and we're not at war with the community, and we're not. It's not an us versus them mentality. So some of those mentalities have broken down, especially under geo-based policing, and we don't see a lot of that here. But we do need equipment to protect ourselves and do our job. And I'll turn it over to Chief Brackney for her perspective on the matter.
So thank you. I think, and thank you for the question. I think, unfortunately, oftentimes we lionize and romanticize what policing actually looked like when we say there was an officer on the beat back in the day and he knew the community and the community knew him, right? Often we have a very nostalgic and rosy lens by which we look at that. And what I've said to, I think, the communities is what we're really asking for is a relationship with our officers, right? That's the model, or that's the only example that we know, is to say, oh, there was a cop that walked the beat and we knew that cop and that cop knew us. And what I've said is this world the exact same world of when the 1960s and 70s, when you were on the corners and you had neighborhoods that looked very differently than what our neighborhoods look like today, with very transient populations and transient communities. So we don't even have established neighborhoods the way that we used to have them growing up ourselves. So is there even that possibility? What I think we're longing for, and building on what both of the captains said, is a relational policing. I don't use words like community policing. I use, do we have a relational policing model in which that is a process and not necessarily a program in which it's scripted on how you engage in the community? How do you build up relationships more than you do anything else? And the paramilitary concept, the warrior mentality, the us versus them mentality, as I just started when I talked about the history of policing, it was built on an us versus them mentality, right? That was part of what was ingrained into the slave patrol concept and mindset, that this was an us versus them mentality. We were protecting us from them, right? And that was the model in which the policing was built on. So there's really needing to be a shift in culture, as well as what does it look like to reform. And I know Don talked about reforming police. Sometimes you have to think, is this really a system that needs to be reformed, or is this a system that needs to be completely deconstructed and rebuilt under a different format? Because often I think of reform, I think of just like, you know, you remodel your house, or you might do some renovations at the house. There might be a time when you need to level or raise the house and start building it on a solid foundation of what that really looks like. In terms of the things that we're doing and trying to really be present in the community. My mandate for the last 2 years has been that we will not engage in one-offs. One-offs do nothing to build relationships. They do not build trust, legitimacy, and transparency. The things that we need to do are those things that are long-term sustainable, that one, hold us to a standard of accountability to the community. And that comes through a variety of models, including transparency. Everyone knows or does know about Seville Night Out. Everyone knows about Cops and Kids, these very big programs, Ice Cream with the Cop and things of that nature. But I asked our officers, are we getting really the penetration into the communities that we would desire? Or are these just flyer moments or photo op moments that we really are not, you know, making entree into the community? So just before COVID hit, we talked about community conversations, where literally I would be in different parts of the community, advertise where we're going to be, and we can, in small groups, right, hear about what's going on in the community and how we can make an impact into the community. These can't be screaming sessions, they can't be venting sessions, although you have to allow people the opportunity to vent. But if all they become is, as Don says, these targeted attacks versus really just, you know, getting ourselves to coalesce around an idea of what it is to be in a healthy relationship with our police department, that's one of the things. We've identified liaisons for almost every community group that we have that we could come up with. The faith community, our Hispanic, our Latinx community. We have liaisons with our public housing community, our senior communities, our LGBTQ plus communities, which we identify one person you know within our department that you can have a direct connection with to represent that represents whatever that space that you're operating in. And to include our immigrant community. We brought in, and I will always say this wrong, so please, Sean, get on me. Sinbaradas has been in with us to teach our officer, I got a thumbs up, to teach our officers Spanish. And let me tell you why that was important. The only Spanish courses that were available to our officers very much were the warrior mindset. It was street survival Spanish for officers, right? Street survival Spanish, which gives the impression that if you don't speak Spanish and you encounter someone who does, you might not survive that encounter. So how do we reframe even the language and the mindset to recreate a culture in which the police are part of the community, right? And policing is a community aspect in which we all are involved in that co-production of public safety. And I can't do that if we're in this paramilitary us versus them mentality. We have lots of transparency on our websites. Go on it. You can find just about anything you are wanting about the police department, including our officer-initiated detentions, our use of force, including the type of force we use, the race and gender of the officers, the race and gender of the subject that we did that. We now release all of our charging data for the last 5 years, our internal affairs outcomes, when you make complaints, what the outcome of those complaints were. And that is a lot of information the community deserves, and rightfully so, to have.
Don.
Chief Brackney. Yeah, Don, what do you as a member of the Citizens Review Board and large member of the community, what is your perspective of the police and community engagements?
When we talk about reconstruction of the house, if you will, a very good friend of mine, Reverend Phil Woodson, told me you can't possibly deconstruct the master's house using the master's tools. We've got to come up with a different way. We've got to get out of the box. We got to look at some things that we haven't looked at before. When we look at the militarization of the police in a local community, what that does is it manifests the potential to create war zones in those communities. And many times that's in the disadvantaged, that's in the low income, that's in the minority communities. And one of the, I think it was also Captain Reeves said that sometimes that equipment is necessary to protect the officers. Well, many in the community feel like they need protection from some of those officers. And I don't think that you want community members going out purchasing tanks. We just don't need that type of thing in our streets and in our communities, because one, it signals bad intentions. That type of thing can't sit well in anybody's stomach. Two, it puts people not at ease, but on guard. And we just don't need our community on edge any more than they already are and already have been, and with good reason. We've just got to be willing and open to changing some things in the ways that we do things. And the first thing that we need to do is start changing some mindsets. I was in on a call earlier today. It was a joint committee meeting of courts of justice and public safety committees. And one of the people who testified was the chair of the State Sheriff's Association. And he said that in regards to the George Floyd matter, he was very much disheartened because all of the law enforcement officers in the world would be painted with the same brush because of that situation. Now, understand, he didn't say that he was disheartened because he saw that unfold in front of his eyes, the murder of a man at the hands of law enforcement. He was disheartened at the perception that all the world would have because of that. Those are two very different things. They're not at all similar in any way. So it's the mindset that we have to start with before we can enact any real change.
Don, when you say that people feel, when they see tanks, is that the consensus of people you think in the Charlottesville community and Charlottesville at large, right? Charlottesville, Albemarle, the surrounding communities. Is that what you've heard from people that you interact with, or is this also largely or some based on things that we see going on in other parts of the country?
It's a little of both. And when we talk about the Charlottesville community, of course, we go back to 2017 when we had the AMRETs rolling through our community. And even more recently, a situation over at 7th and Dice Street that thankfully our local law enforcement was not involved with. And from all accounts, from what I understand from Chief, didn't know anything at all about. That was strictly a state police operation. But it's those type of situations that tend to cause and further to drive the wedge of distrust between the community and law enforcement.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's about striking that balance, along with being in the military myself. I have a SWAT team background. It's my understanding Chief Brackney also has a SWAT background too. So when you're talking about the militarization of the police department, we have to be specific in what it is we're talking about and what equipment it is that you're talking about, because there are tools that actually serve a purpose. there are, just like there's police officers that have weapon systems, there are offenders out there, there are criminals out there in our streets, in our community, that do have AK-47s. And there are, just like in Albemarle County, we have incidents where we have, hunters that go out there, or people that have high-end firearms out there that will go out in the woods, that get domestics, that take hostages. And I'm talking about things that have happened this past year. And we need to protect, we do it to protect not only ourselves, but the citizens as well. So we need to be careful what we say, or be clear, not careful, we need to be clear when we talk about what equipment that we're specifically talking about, when we talk about the demilitarization. So if we're talking about disarming all police and because I've heard that come up in some conversations, we don't want police carrying guns and firearms. You're going to see, record high officer fatality rates, and it's just that is just a scary thought. Asking our officers to go in with that type of that type of handicap and disadvantage, in order to do their job and put their lives at risk. So, shifting gears just a little bit along these same subjects, we talk about use of force and why it is that we do what we do. I partnered with Andrea coming out of our class. LC19 was the first class to actually take folks down to our range, class members down to the police department range, and put them through the use of force simulator. And that was so well received and so eye-opening for people to be put in the position of what it's like and the split-second decisions our officers are put in, that we started incorporating and following classes in partnership with Region 10. So there's a mental health care component to that, but also putting citizens through what it's like to be put in those use of force situations and their decision-making process as well.
As you said, there are citizens out there with those militarized weapons that no one wants to take on the NRA to actually call them military-style weapons. But no one's advocating for violence against the police at all. But if your fear is that there'll be an increased number, a high number of officers being killed or officers' fatalities, we're looking right down the barrel right now, if you will, of an increasing number of Black men getting shot down in the street at the hands of the police. And that's just as disheartening as officers getting shot. Since 2016, we have had 91 officer-involved shootings here in the state of Virginia. And of those, there's only been one of those that's been found at fault. Now, maybe that's just the high level of training that's done. Maybe it's some things that are going on in the judicial system that officers just aren't being held accountable or to the same standard that regular citizens are. But that's just those are just numbers that we can't ignore.
Hey, Scott, I'm sorry, Chief Brackney. I'm monitoring the chat, and so we had a couple of questions come in, so I wanted to make sure that we have time to answer as many as possible, because this is really good information. So the question here is a little bit about the presidential election and the run up to that, high tensions. How are you all, preparing for that, right? Preparing for what the implications to citizen safety may be as a result of the election.
So there's a couple ways that I want to at least think about what this looks like, right? As a combination along a spectrum. Elections are and things that are in the legislature, either locally, regionally, or even nationally, all take on a lot of significance and meaning right now. And our planning has to be, how do we, as you hear me say over and over and over and over again, how do we balance the safety and security of the persons that we are to protect with their access and convenience? And I think what I would talk about is, these Second Amendment responses, right? How do we, there's a lot of push in the Virginia legislature that says that, hey, you can limit weapons coming into public spaces, into your public parks and by the localities, right? And a lot of that push came out of what occurred in 2017 in Charlottesville, where there was no ability to really limit in a very pro-Second Amendment state. And as Don said, willingness to take on the NRA. And there are some of you who know I very much went in front of Congress and took on the NRA and called it that we needed to ban assault weapons that were being used to hunt human beings, intentionally used to hunt human beings. And that was met with absolute controversy across the nation, where petitions were started asking for my resignation, including certain local and regional police departments that were retweeting all of the NRA stuff or putting it on their personal Facebook to shame our department. And I will stand by that we need to really think about what does weaponry look like. And I think to build on what Captain Reeves is saying, Don, I agree with you. This is not just personal protective equipment for officers. What does that personal protective equipment look like when you are outgunned and at high caliber rifles and have no vehicles to even get in there to save human beings who are under attack? I look at what happened in Las Vegas. Let's look what happened in Pulse nightclub. Let's look what happened in Columbia, South Carolina. Let's look at all these places where they are using very high-end weaponry that is still going to be in existence regardless of what any of us do within our police department. And then what I would ask the community is, what are those resources that you would want your police department to have in place when they are the ones, it's not about protecting themselves, when they are the ones who are now being asked to protect you from those type of assaults? What type of weaponry would we have wanted for officers to have in place? And as we're jumping up, someone's saying, let's look at the Camden model of New Jersey. What happened under the Camden model? Do not be fooled by what these models are coming on when they said, oh, Camden got rid of its police department. No, it did not. It did not get rid of its police department. What it did was, in the interim, as it was refashioning its police department, the state police and other municipalities came in and policed that community while that community was under construction, or that model was under construction. So what does that look like here in Charlottesville? I often say, don't use somebody else's model and think that cookie cutter is going to work here. We need a very much a tailored response to how we engage in policing here. So Camden was successful in that it reduced its number of use of force and things of that nature here. But also, too, who was the leader that was sitting in that place when they were attempting to put these models together? And we know cultural change takes a long time to answer someone else's questions, and these are urgent matters. What we have always found out is that we respond to urgent matters very quickly and find out that we have put together a process or a program that is not the one that we want. We heard that even on council. As Monday in Charlottesville, the petitioner put together a petition where he wanted to demilitarize the Charlottesville Police Department, and then said, well, I'm not happy with what you just passed, when it was word for word the petition's resolution, because we were trying to do things expediently instead of doing things well. And I think there needs to be some discussion of what is it that we want to do and do well in this region that serves this region, and not necessarily jump on bandwagons, hashtags, or any of the other things to say that we've done something versus doing something well here that's sustainable.
So another question that we had, this is a multi-part question coming in from LC19. I see you, Emily. How are police departments listening to changes community members want to see? How are communities leading those discussions, not just being invited to the table? And how are police departments being sure to hear all voices, not only the ones who always show up to the meetings? I'm going to stop there. Maybe we'll kick it over to Albemarle PD. And then I also have a question here for Don.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, for the question. Yeah. So Albemarle County, we've recently started outreach programs with our at the county executive level with our communications director, as well as the development of an Office of Equity and Inclusion. So we do have outreach when it comes to our social media page and listen to people. We do have people actually monitor our social media page and respond to folks on that page. We also have Chiefs Advisory Council, which is a group of citizens, as well as those of you unfamiliar with Albemarle County. Albemarle County is divided into two separate districts. We have the Blue Ridge and Jefferson districts, one of which Captain Byers is commander of, and each commander has a citizens advisory committee team underneath them as well. And through community contacts, going to town halls, participating in events like this, and capitalizing on our networks when we're invited to programs or doing outreach to folks who might want to hear from the police. It's hard to do right now in this environment, but we are doing it virtually. But we also do it in person, pre-COVID and post-COVID. So our message is getting out there, and we are available, and that includes complaints too. Our complaint process, when a citizen does have a concern, we have an internal affairs, we have anonymous reporting, telephone reporting. We investigate a wide variety of complaints when it comes to that. So access to the police department, can we do better? Sure. And we're open to ideas and suggestions on how we can improve and enhance communications with our public. Hopefully that answered all those questions. Or
so that was part of it. I think another part of that question, Sean, is how do the requests that people make become actions? And there's also a question as part of that about the timeline, right? So we're in an age right now where, like Chief Brackney said, things are urgent. So how do those requests from the community get into action?
It's all contextual. It depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. I'll talk about the SRO program in the county because that's something that's near and dear to my heart. Because several years ago, I was the school resource officer. That's what an SRO is. Since I'm using police jargon, the school resource officers in the county. I helped redevelop and remold what our SRO program is and how it's defined. It's not these authoritarian overlord figures that feed into the school to prison pipeline. It's to do community outreach. We actually partnered for several years with the Charlottesville school resource officers. Every single year we do outreach in a summer camp where we reach to at-risk youth and identified working with their parents. One of our LC19 parents, alumni, one of her students was a student, and we help build those bridges between rising middle school kids, doing gang prevention, gang awareness, doing security at football games, paying pickup basketball games with students, eating lunch with them, listen to their problems. And what that does is it opened up dialogue between kids and the police, dispelling some of the misconceptions that they might have, because some kids have traumatic experiences with police. They'll tell us that, hey, I don't like the police because the police, took away my mother or father and locked them up, and trying to explain that not all police are like that. And this is what we do, and trying to change that image. And then there are certain kids that feel more comfortable talking to police because we've established those relationships with them, along with being there for their security in the school, to prevent from active shooter events or any other, catastrophic event that occurs in the school. About building those relationships, whether it's help bring the next girl in to talk to teenage girls about what you're about to go through when you enter the real world, and being careful out there. In cybersecurity, about respecting yourself. We partner with UVA and bringing kids in and speak with the female student athletes there. So there's a lot of valuable things that aren't being captured in this narrative of get rid of cops out of our schools. When you say it like that, it gives the image of we're doing something wrong in the schools, But when you take the time and listen and say this is what our schools are doing, or that survey they went out to Albemarle County Public Schools, 84% positive feedback from students, and yet there's still this narrative: get rid of SROs, get rid of the cops out of the school. And so to answer Emily's point, it's all about what it is you're trying to accomplish, and the urgency of it. And are there certain things that need to be reformed, like chokeholds? If our department doesn't have a chokehold policy, but if we did, that'd be an immediate action. That's something that would go through the use of force, and we'd eliminate that policy. And we'd be clear and make a statement: hey, this is something that immediately needs to be done. But when you're talking about systemic, broad issues like, Chief Brackney was, when we talk about criminal justice reform, those take times, those take partnerships, because what we're talking about, there's a lot of things that police departments can't do alone, that we need these community partnerships for. So hopefully that answered the second part of that question.
Hey,
And guys, we're getting a lot of questions in. I want to be respectful for everyone's time. And for all these issues, we can go on for a long time about them, but I just want to pose a question, because when we talk about these things that are happening nationwide, right, we're all seeing it, we're all feeling it. But when we're talking about our area, I know you can't speak to what's happening in every precinct in the country, but when it comes to Charlottesville and Albemarle County, like, what if you get a report, if a citizen gives a report that something happened, officer involved, a complaint, what does that process look like here?
So I'll take that on first, and then I'm sure that Daryl or Sean will just jump right on in there as to what their process looks like, because if I'm correct, Captain Byers used to be in charge of or ran the Internal Affairs Division there, so he can give you a wonderful answer about what that occurs here. So we have when I arrived here, one of the local community members was extremely vocal and called our internal affairs a black hole. I had arrived here in June of 2018, and they were indicating that since 2016, questions had not been answered or cases had not been resolved about the intake or the giving of complaints to the Charlottesville Police Department. And they were right. I had to come out and publicly admit that the community person was correct. When there were cases going to internal affairs, I had an audit done of our system and found out in 2018, since 2016, if a case went directly to internal affairs and not being redistributed out into the captain's levels to investigate because they were different type of complaints, service type of complaints, not one case had been closed in 2 years out of our internal affairs office. Can you imagine the distrust the community says, we brought an issue before you and it was nothing. So now literally, our policies are on our website about the internal affairs process that says how a process or a complaint now comes into the system, that you immediately get a response letter says that we acknowledge your complaint, and that you will hear from someone. The officers have 45 days, the internal affairs, to resolve that first complaint or do an investigation. If it is not resolved in 45 days, they must directly ask me for permission for a 30-day extension. And included in that request has to be why they need that extension, what they hope to accomplish within that 30 days, and then the actual time when they say that they will be done with that. So I need within 30 days, this is my deadlines and this is my deadlines. The complainant will then get a letter back saying what the actual outcome was of that and an opportunity to discuss that complaint with the investigator. We now post those on our website that says on this date, the complaint came in, this date we resolved it. This is the nature of the complaint. Someone said we were rude or discourteous or there was racial profiling, and also the outcome of those complaints, whether it was sustained, et cetera, including the definition. We are now including on those complaints if we found additional collateral violations of our policy. So there may have been a complaint about discourtesy, but then we found that the officer, when we looked at it, had not activated their body-worn cameras or had not activated their mobile video recording devices. And then we automatically sustain that complaint portion of it. So we may found that the officer, we can't resolve their discourtesy because the officer did not put on their body-worn camera. So we then sustained that they did not do that. And then there's the different avenues that we can do through either counseling, training, written reprimands, oral reprimands, suspensions, terminations. There's a variety of those. Unfortunately, community will often say to me, I want the results of that, right? What did you do to that officer? Nothing was done. I can't release personnel records. The city has a policy where it does not release personnel records. This isn't the Chief Brackney rule. This is the City of Charlottesville HR rule. So we often sometimes think that it only stays in my space and I'm making the sole arbiter of those things. So our policies are on our website as well. And I'm sure ACBD has a very similar policy.
Yeah, so we had very similar practice, and I won't rehash everything that the chief just said. The only thing that I would add to it is kind of what Captain Reeves said earlier, is that how do the complaints come in? And so, you know, we take them however they come in. If it's anonymous, we'll take them. If it's third party, we'll take them. We'll take complaints however they come in. The other thing that I would add to that is that we now, and I think Chief Brackney department does too, but we now have a system where we can monitor officers and the number of complaints that they get. And we call it an early intervention, early warning system. So it lets us know, hey, this officer is getting a lot of complaints. So the supervisors need to kind of look at that. They can gather information about these complaints and kind of work with this officer as it relates to their performance. You know, have a performance review with that officer, put them on a plan of assistance as it relates to what their actions are. And if they can't change, then obviously they're not meant to be a police officer, particularly for Albemarle County or the city of Charlottesville, and it just won't work out well for them.
And when we're talking about officer and community relations, you know, we hear a lot about the Citizens Review Board. Don, can you talk about what the job of the Citizens Review Board is, and how that relates to community relations with the police department?
It gives oversight, if you will, to the community who feels like their complaints often have gone unheard. I've often said that it's an insurance policy both for the citizens as well as for those officers that are doing the job correctly and the way that they should every day. Because if someone offers up a complaint, excuse me, you now have an independent board of people who can review that complaint and can come back with the finding totally and completely aside from what they might get if the Internal Affairs Department was looking at it themselves. I see the question in the chat, what are some of the things that we might consider that we could do different? And the Civilian Review Board is certainly one of those things that was born out of the Blue Ribbon Commission from some 4 years ago now. And giving them the space and the capacity and the latitude that they need in order to do a thorough and complete job. That's one thing that we could do locally. Again, the calls to defund the police and reallocate some of those resources towards mental health, towards social services, that would be another huge step. At the state level, there are many things that we could do. We could eliminate the civil liability shield. We could eliminate qualified immunity. People have often said that culture eats policy for lunch. We need to actually hold police accountable to the same laws that they're hired to enforce. And if we can just follow the model that's been laid forth by the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, I think that we can take some real concrete progressive steps towards getting some of these things addressed. If we would amend the Virginia Tort Claims Act, or at least enact a new statute that would allow people to bring actions against a law enforcement officer who violates their any constitutional provision. It's another step that we could take. So there are many things that we could do as opposed to just picking away at the crumbs off that loaf of bread while we try to say that we want to enact real change.
We have another question. I want to try to get to this one, Scott. There was a follow-up question, Chief Brackney, about what was going on in Camden. And so the question is, what were some of the things that did work as opposed to, you know, some of the things that didn't work, or what are some things that we could pull out, you know, and maybe replicate or duplicate?
So when we talk about, when we talk about any model, I always start with, what is the problem we're attempting to solve? And are we using the right approach, tools, perspective to get us there? So Camden was looking at an attempt to reduce crime. And that's the model they used. And the approach they used was to reduce crime. It did have the effect of reducing violent crime in the community. So that's why I'm saying we want to be careful about what those models are. If that is the model we want to use to reduce violent crime in Charlottesville, you have to look at the back end of what they found out about the model. Yes, crime was reduced, but what they found out, and again, this is all really new with not a lot of research to it as well, but the research that is coming out of it said that the groups that they thought that were going to be disproportionately impacted exactly were. That minorities were, because they were doing summons, zero tolerance for any type of crimes, and that, again, there are these disproportionalities in systems. What I would ask is, in Charlottesville, what is the problem that we specifically want to solve around police interactions, right? We've had these studies that came out about the disproportionate minority contact study, the DMC study in the region, in both which Charlottesville and Albemarle both participated, in which we were given some insight into some of the areas in the criminal justice system. I think for Charlottesville, particularly, what I would be interested in is thinking about building on models that have a co-production of public safety, in which we infuse some of the 21st century policing concepts into that. And how might that occur here is exactly one of the questions said is, how are the listening sessions going? Who's invited into the conversation? Is it the exact same people who are the loudest voices in the room? Or is there a way to get that out? And for me, it seems like the best approach would be twofold. August 4th, there is a community listening session. It is a 3-hour listening session that I am participating in with Mayor Walker, Manager Richardson, and I'm not sure who else may be part of that. Then Mayor Walker and I are both having this kind of one-on-one conversation August 11th to say, what does it look like to have a different type of policing in the community that meets the needs of Charlottesville? And that's important conversations. I also suggested that they have a council on the go. You know, we often have these council meetings in which everything occurs down in the city council chambers. What does that look like to go take council into the community, so that the second meeting of the month is held in a very different community, so that you have the opportunity to elevate different voices and different perspectives, so that people who've been or feel like they've been shut out of the process has that ability. And that would also include our police department. Getting out, as I said, having these community conversations just before COVID hit in each of the different communities, so voices can be elevated and not become this cancel culture when people don't agree with the perspectives or the voices that are now being part of the conversation. So from what the Camden model I would take from it is the opportunity to think about being courageous to how do we envision or reimagine policing in the region, that being able to take that bold step to say, you know what, and I'm willing to do that, whoever that person is sitting in these seats of power and influence, I'm willing to do that very differently than what has been presented in the past. So from Camden, I would take their courageousness, I would take their willingness to think outside the box, as Don had indicated previously, with Pastor Wolfert and the way he approaches it. You can't deconstruct a master's house with the master's tools. The way you deconstruct that is with the community's tools. What are those tools we are all going to be willing to bring to bear and take responsibility and ownership for when we all come to the table, and then hold us all accountable so that we're all well-informed, well-trained, that we bring a lens with us that doesn't necessarily bring one of, you know, defense or posture, but a willingness to come through this with a lens of openness and acceptance and willing to hear and be heard.
Thank you so much. Chief, go ahead, Scott. I just wanted to say a couple of things before we start getting ready to wrap up, because it's 3:10.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like Chief Brackney said, these are about talking about being courageous. That's why we're having these conversations here. And it's great that we're doing this. And I think we could talk for several hours, I know, but like I said, we want to be respectful for everyone's time. But how do we, this is what we put together as Leadership Charlottesville, but how do we bring this out to the community entirely? How do regular citizens hear these types of conversations or get involved? What are some action items that we can take as citizens to do, and what can the law enforcement in the area do more of to connect with the community?
One bold step was, instead of us taking those small steps, we need to take that giant leap for mankind. One thing would be if the law enforcement lobbyists at the state level would push for legislation that would make it easier to decertify those officers that are problematic. If they would if those lobbyists would get behind that, because in the most recent 7 years reported, there've only been some less than 35 officers that have been decertified in the state. And the problem is that they can leave one agency and go get hired at another one. So if we can enact that type of legislation, it would be huge. If we can get behind the 8 Can't Wait campaign, and if anyone's not familiar with that, it's just 8 action items that can be enacted very easily, just as policy in various law enforcement agencies across the state. The banning of chokeholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring warnings before shootings, requiring requiring them to exhaust all alternatives before shooting. A duty to intervene, ban shooting at moving vehicles, requiring the use of force continuum, and requiring comprehensive reporting. Those are just things that can be enacted just as matters of policy in each agency going across the board.
And Don, that's part of Campaign Zero. So we need to be real careful. 8 Can't Wait is some suggestions under Campaign Zero. So you want to look up actually Campaign Zero, because we do look at the taglines of what Campaign Zero says on the 8 Can't Wait. But if you click further into them, it's not as simple as them saying, don't do this, right? It says, give warning shots. But then if you read further in, it says, if available, can do it under best circumstances. So we will often use what we hear as the first part of the intro of a sentence, and then not dig deeper. And then we get behind something that probably may not be the best fit for us. Although there are some portions of it that are absolutely appropriate, that we should all be able to get behind and say, you know what, this is something that I have no issue with whatsoever. There's also some additional things that I think we absolutely can do. I'm part of a group with the University of Southern California for USC to establish a national database for and wait for decertified officers to get into it, and say that any law enforcement agency can access this to say an officer has been decertified, because we may not know from state to state if they've already been decertified and they then are attempting to be hired here. I also push that part of that database says 3 things: that it's terminations, resignation in lieu of termination, which a lot of people will do to avoid the prolonged one, but also voluntary resignations when the person is not offered resignation in lieu of termination, but they realize that it's coming down the pike, so they exit. That's their exit strategy. I've also pushed with the Virginia DCJS that we had an officer that resigned that I wanted to terminate, but he resigned before the process was done, his due process. He doesn't qualify for decertification under Virginia statutes. I'm pushing to have him decertified as an exception. Because the decertification says you must be convicted of certain crimes, right? So if we're in the process of saying internally, we would have convicted you of this crime had the person prosecuted you, then that should be enough as well, right? And to add things that they're not adding things before, like sexual assault, sexual harassment. We always think about domestic violence, or we think about an assault of, a choking or a shooting or something like that. But that scale should be a lot broader. That spectrum should be a lot broader for those persons that we are putting in these highly visible places with formal and informal authority to take someone's life. literally their life and their liberty. So I agree with you, Don. There's things we can do locally. And as I tell people, if your social media presence is greater than your actual presence out there on the front lines, you're not a player in this game. You're nothing more than a mascot, right? You need to have your actual presence at a greater level than your social media presence. You can't be a social media, social justice warrior. That actually is the time when you need to be a warrior and have that warrior mindset, and a shifting of it from the one that we've had to the one that the community has.